What is financialization? What do people think about health insurance in the United States? And what's the relationship between socialism and violence? I'm Dominic Pino, Thomas L. Rhodes Journalism Fellow with the National Review Institute, and we'll look through those questions on this episode of eConception. eConception is a podcast of the American Institute for Economic Research that looks at the economic issues of the day and the broader economic concepts behind them. We're recording today on location from the giant pile of money that the evil financiers have stolen from the workers. Oh, wait, how did Bernie Sanders get to edit this? Financialization is a word that gets thrown around a lot. It can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Sometimes it's describing stuff that's perfectly fine. Other times it's describing stuff that's even good. But sometimes it is describing stuff that's actually bad. And we wanted to get somebody on to talk about it who actually knows a lot about finance because it's his job and he's very good at it. And that's the Chief Investment Officer at the Bahnsen Group, David Bahnsen. Thanks for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me. Good to be with you.
So, financialization, what does it mean when people talk about financialization? What do people usually mean when they say that? And what do you mean when you say that?
Well, I think that in asking that question, it helps us get to kind of the heart of the matter, because I think so much of this is a matter of the definitions. And I come about it from the vantage point of believing that there is such a thing as financialization that ought to be identified as a net negative into the economy and our goals for the economy. And yet what I'm defining it as is categorically different than what most people who would use the term are defining it as. And ironically, those that profess to be most concerned with financialization are not incorporating the areas that I am most focused on, which I think are arguably far more detrimental to the stuff they say they're concerned about than anything else. And so I think this is one of those areas that has multiple bad actors, like there's a number of things to be pushing back on, either poorly defined financialization or wrongly diagnosed or wrongly remedied. And there's a bit of all of the above going on in this subject.
Yeah, so sometimes it's just a demonization of banks or of financiers or of financial institutions, Wall Street, things like that. And that's a lot of times just classic class warfare. We have that in lots of different areas too. It's not really specific to finance. Other times people are talking about how finance is a bigger part of the economy today than it used to be in the past. That's a little bit more specific, but doesn't necessarily mean something was good or bad. It's just it's a thing that's going on. And then there's another criticism, which I think is the one that you sort of zero in on, which is finance replacing more productive activity in the economy with less productive activity in the economy? And can you talk a little bit about that last one and what that would actually look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've set this up exactly right, and it's the kind of fundamental thesis of the paper that I recently wrote for AIER is that financialization as a rhetorical cover for class warfare is unhelpful and counterproductive to the need of the hour. If one is critical of the size of the financial sector in the economy, then they have a further burden to be able to establish that the size of financial activity in the economy is extracting from other elements of economic growth and productivity. And I believe that would be a burden they would not be able to meet. Where you get into a more useful framework is where productivity is being sacrificed because there is activity being done that does not have a useful economic aim. And so to make this very simple, Ironically, much of what is called and critiqued as financialization are the very things that are contributing at a meaningful level to productivity in the economy, to efficient allocation of resources. And whether it be something like private equity, M&A, various components that represent financial transactions that have capital markets behind them, just simply associating it with Wall Street doesn't form any kind of basis for critique. However, if you were to then turn towards what I would argue is the malignant impact of monetary policy on decision making in the economy, then I think you're onto something much more justifiable, where you could argue that the effect of artificially low interest rates creates incentives to not produce new goods and services, or do not produce new risk-taking enterprises or projects or capital expenditures, and to substitute those things with leverage on already existing instruments. So the financial actor has the ability to generate a return by not having to produce anything new, by using leverage on a pre-existing financial asset. And that, to me, is a more legitimate basis of critique than the mere existence of financial instrumentation in the administration of our economy, such as private equity or private credit or M&A.
Yeah, really that description of replacing more productive activity with less productive activity, that's what government does when it gets involved in markets. That's what the Fed can do in certain areas, but it's also what fiscal policy can do. We see, one classic example of this from the government's perspective is tariffs and trade policy, right? You're redistributing profits from more productive firms to less productive firms. But that's not really what people mean by financialization. What are the financial ways that government is able to do that?
That government's able to impede productive activity?
Yes.
Well, I would suggest that the tax and regulation categories will pretty much cover all of it. And there's a lot of nuances and subcategories within those two things. And so excessive taxation this is sort of the fundamental battle cry of the supply side movement, that it alters incentives. And there are things that government will use tax policy to do to try to manipulate consumption, which is the very conscious and self-aware strategy of the Keynesian worldview. And the thing that the supply siders are responding to are the impediments government can create to production. And so where there's been a lot of common ground and kindred brotherhood amongst classical Chicago and Austrian economics over the years is on the supply side of things, that government via tax and regulation and cronyism can alter incentives that basically form impediments. A great example that was, famously discussed by Ronald Reagan was just the high burden of marginal rates was causing Hollywood actors to wait till the next calendar year to take their next movie, where they could have been making 2 in a year. They were making 1 the next year because they wanted to spread the tax burden off, and things like that are not really all that complicated. Tax rates and how they impact behavior applied to marginal economics in a graduated tax code is really pretty basic math. The regulatory state and then the cronyism that flows from it is the larger issue now, especially in a world where our top marginal rates are not 70 or 90% anymore. I would love to see 37% rates be 33%, and I'd love to see 28% rates be 25%, but that isn't the same needle mover that it would have been when 70 went to 28. However, the regulatory state, I believe, has served the purpose of protecting fiefdoms of other companies that built something great and then do not have to face the competition that can make them greater. because regulatory apparatus is keeping those competitors from being formidable. And so much of what gets criticized in the here and now about capitalism is really a critique of cronyism. And that cronyism is only made possible by the heavy regulatory apparatus.
Yeah, I think one of the areas that does show up, though, is in finance, right? You hear it commonly talked about that since the Great Recession, the sort of popular narrative will be something along the lines of, the financial institutions screwed up. They caused this major problem for the entire world economy, and then they got bailed out because they were friends with government, and nobody else gets treated like that. The regular guy doesn't get bailed out. It's only the rich guys who are friends with politicians. What, if anything, is wrong with that sort of story?
Well, for one thing, just historically, it would be news to the equity holders of Lehman Brothers or Citigroup or Bear Stearns that it was beneficial to be friends with the regulators, since they all got their faces ripped off. Now, it's true, Citi technically exists, but when people see a $70 stock, it did a 1-for-10 reverse split. It's essentially, a $5, $6, or $7 stock split adjusted to what it had once been. It's down something in the range of 90% of where it had been 15 to 20 years ago. And then, of course, Lehman and Bear, their equity has been fully gone. So there wasn't really a bailout of the shareholders, and guys like Jimmy Keane at Bear Stearns, who has now passed away, and Dick Fullett at Lehman, they owned all their equity. It wasn't like, well, they had cashed out of all of it and then the equity tanked and they left some money on the table. They owned it all. So there's just a few historical misnomers that are a little bit inconvenient to the narrative. And it's a big critique I have of those of us who are critical of a lot of what happened in 2008. And this was sort of, career-centric moments for me. And I was a managing director at Morgan Stanley throughout the financial crisis and very involved in a lot of these meetings and discussions. I and yet still held a very strong economic, political, and social commentary on everything that was happening. And I will say that it was a bond bailout, and it was and a depositor bailout, and not a Wall Street bailout. And yet that doesn't really sound as interesting in terms of a class warfare narrative. The people who had strong connections in a lot of cases were hurt the most out of it. Now, of course, you have to say, well, why would the bondholders have been protected? But this is a more complicated issue that speaks to, I think, another malignant part of the overall system, but it doesn't necessarily speak to class warfare. It's that the world we would live in terms of bond yields and borrowing cost would be significantly higher if the central bank was willing to not accommodate fiscal policy, and B, the policymakers were willing to let creditors get their faces ripped off every now and then, and they're mostly not. And by not doing so, it facilitates lower borrowing cost, which is very necessary for our policy objectives of having a highly leveraged economy. So again, this all still ends up coming down to the indebtedness of the system. And the biggest beneficiary of that is not Wall Street, it's the federal government. And so you could not have the federal government borrowing that we have in a 10% rate environment. But you could not have a 2, 3, or 4% rate environment in a world where bondholders were forced to eat their losses in 2008. And even subsequent to financial crisis, the counterparty risk through the European sovereign debt crisis was deeply connected to the need to protect creditors. So there's cronyism in this, but it's a little confused as to who the crony beneficiaries have always been.
One of the things that you do in your paper that I think is really helpful is you sort of just run rapid fire through a couple of different enemies that get constantly trotted out in a lot of our political conversations. And you go through several of them. For the sake of time, I just want to focus on two because I find them to be the most interesting. But if you want to read all of them, listeners should go check out your paper at AIER.org. The two I want to focus on are private equity and stock buybacks. So private equity, I think, gets demonized a lot because people have this idea that private equity is what happens when a company is doing just fine, but then these greedy guys in suits come in and they buy it out, and then they're only focused on profit and they hate the workers, and so they end up making a ton of money on it, and the company becomes more profitable, but they do it at the expense of labor. And this is a part of the problem with the American economy. What is private equity actually, first of all, and what actually happens?
Well, private equity is a really good one to kind of focus on because it is by far the most ignorant of the critiques that are offered in those that are going after the broader apparatus of financial markets and financial actors. Fundamentally, it's people that are investing in the equity of privately held businesses, that is, businesses that are not publicly traded. But the other component is that very often that equity investment is coupled with a significant use of debt. And then the objective in them taking an interest in a company is quite diverse. There are turnaround stories or rescue stories where private equity is coming into a troubled company to try to change it. There are growth stories where there's just very good, well-run companies doing great, but with an addition of primary capital could become much greater. And then there's those that are just simply looking for an exit. And by going to a larger capital partner that has filled with strategic resources, it can make for a more profitable entity, give founders and early entrepreneurs monetization, and then allow for a bigger and better company. And the American economy since the 1980s is filled with so many examples of these success stories that it is truly embarrassing to truth tellers that we will look at some of the companies that failed with private equity investment and try to make that to be normative. Companies that had some influx of capital from the private equity space that ended up subsequently going bankrupt, Chuck E. Cheese, Toys R Us, Neiman Marcus. These happen to be name brand, generally consumer-oriented companies. And there's certainly companies that got investor money that subsequently failed. How that is meant to be an indictment of the private equity industry defies reason. And so why would they be in the crosshairs of these critics? I think the most common reason is a form of class warfare, but there are people who believe the use of borrowed capital is part of the problem, that because so much of what is called a leveraged buyout is a big subcategory of private equity, that many do not like the advantages that exist in using borrowed money to effect an equity transaction. Despite the various problems with critiquing this due to private property rights and individual stakeholders, bearing the both risk and reward of the decisions that are made, there's also just empirically the fact that this has net worked out time and time again to the benefit of the LPs who are the equity investors, the limited partners that are very often pension funds, endowments, institutions. It's increasingly become an avenue of democratized investor base through private wealth in the space I work in. But it's also been wildly profitable to the creditors, that there have either been significant cash flow coverage that has paid them with very high interest and then some, or where there has been defaults. There's very often been great recovery as the creditors who are senior to the equity guys wipe out the equity guys, but then take over the company with a more favorable debt profile now and ability to kind of recreate. To say that you're critical of a company failing, though, Dominic, is a criticism of a market economy. There will always be success stories and failures. The question is whether or not private equity is damaging non-interested actors There could be risk takers that don't get a good return on their investment, either on the debt or equity side, but that is by no means systemic. What is systemic is when we democratize the losses. Private equity does not do that. It holds in its own lane the appropriate level of priced risk and reward for equity and debt. And so I think we ought to be celebrating that and recognizing that it is doing so outside of the banking system. It is not systemic, and it is opening up opportunities for job creation, for production of new goods and services, and more innovative capital market mechanisms that have been clearly a driver of economic growth.
And the other one is stock buybacks, and that is demonized by the fact that corporations are just using their profits to buy back their own stock and make their own share price go up instead of investing the money in hiring more workers or building new equipment or something else that people think would be a better use of the money. So what's the issue with stock buybacks? And the reason I wanted to highlight this one is that we actually have from the Inflation Reduction Act, the tax on stock buybacks. So this has actually come into a policy in a way that some of these other things might not have.
Yes, and I would add to this that I think I'm uniquely qualified to answer here, because if I were a cronyist, I would want to pile on in demonizing stock buybacks, because it would benefit me, because I run $6.5 billion wealth management firm that is heavily focused on dividend growth. In other words, a competitor to stock buybacks as a means of returning capital to shareholders. And yet, even I, who would benefit from demonization of stock buybacks in terms of what it would mean competitively in capital markets to what I focus on through dividends, see stock buybacks and the demonization of stock buybacks as innately foolhardy, misguided. It is a question of return of capital to shareholders, and it all is based on what a company is doing with its after-tax profits. So you first have to have production of goods and services that are generating after-tax profits. And then with those after-tax profits, the question is what you are going to do. And is it really true that a company could have a thing to do with their money that would create a better return if they bought more machinery, more inventory, more innovation, and they're choosing to not do that better thing so they can temporarily goose markets with more earnings per share by simply reducing the share count? That they're not growing earnings, they're not growing production of goods and services, but by using that money to reduce share count, that is viewed as a more sustainable and substantive way of meeting their best interest than if they were to use the money for something more profitable. Do we really believe our corporate actors are that bad at their jobs? Or is the case that stock buybacks are what one is doing after they have already utilized what they believe is the maximum amount of capital that could go into CapEx and generate the necessary hurdle rate? Oftentimes, by the way, stock buybacks are not used to return capital to shareholders. They're used to offset what had been new stock issuance, because no one talks about this. We made a whole bunch of $50,000 to $150,000 earners rich by giving them stock through stock options, through incentive stock, restricted stock, other mechanism of sharing in the equity ownership of these public companies. And so now, as a means of paying back the corporate stock buybacks are used to offset what has been used in employee compensation. Look, I do believe sometimes companies may be wrong when they have determined what amount they're going to return of capital to shareholders. I think that stock buybacks from an investor standpoint are inferior to dividends in terms of the fact that one can eat dividends and can't eat stock buybacks, and stock buybacks force you to never diversify or mitigate risk. There's a lot of investment arguments I'd make, and investors are free to choose whether or not they consider dividends or stock buybacks to be a more favorable solution for their own means. But the idea that it is coming at the expense of what would be a more rewarding reinvestment in the company, and that these corporate actors are not already funding the appropriate level of inventory and hiring and new project investment, is just a massive misunderstanding of corporate incentives.
Yeah, and I think that gets to the center of your paper. One of the themes of the paper that I really like that you brought out is that it seems like critics of financialization can't decide whether the problem is that finance is too successful or that it's not successful enough. Yeah. They can't decide whether the problem is that there's too much profit and too much money and people are doing too well, or that this entire enterprise is just wasteful, that it is lowering the value of financial activity and is lowering the value of businesses. And I think that fundamental incoherence really speaks to the problem that a lot of these financialization critics have of actually sustaining their criticism.
Well, and it was also a very common mistake that I pointed out in the point of 2008, where a lot of the critics of Wall Street sometimes were saying they were evil geniuses who had their fingers on the strings of the world, and other times were saying they were bumbling idiots who brought the world to its knees. And I said, it's very possible one of those two things is true, but it is not possible that both of them are true. And so I think you're right to highlight that now here we are 15 years later, and there is a sense in which one will say private equity is not creating significant returns or return premium. Avoid it. It's a bad investment. And on the other hand, saying private equity is an unfair way to make money at the expense of workers. And you're very wise to point out that there is something incoherent and inconsistent about those two messages. I think that most people who have never worked on Wall Street, who have to be content to get a media portrayal of our financial markets, would be very surprised to know that Wall Street's filled with fallible people that are often very, very smart, often overrated, sometimes too full of themselves, sometimes really impressive, make good decisions, sometimes make bad ones. In other words, the same thing we would say at an autopsy of technology, of consumer staples. Brilliant marketers make very bad decisions sometimes. Now, you and I, as defenders of a market economy, see this as a feature, not a bug. We learn in price discovery from mistakes that are made. We respond to consumer response to things we put in the market. And I think that Wall Street will make mistakes is a very good thing. But I think the notion that having financial markets itself is an evil thing is a luxury our critics have because they will never have to live in a world without it. They would not be able to comprehend the primitive nature of our economy if we did not have the robust capital markets that we have.
Yeah, I heard Mark Calabria explain this one time, and I thought it was really helpful. As he says, finance fundamentally is about bridging time. It's about, the idea being that when you borrow money, it's what you're saying is I'm going to have this amount of money a couple of years from now, but I don't have it now. And what I need you to do is sort of time travel for me and bring it to me now so that I can use it, invest it, and grow it so I can pay it back. And I think that message really helps to simplify it, I think, for a lot of people, but also to sort of have you stand back and say, wow, that's actually really impressive and really helpful. So thanks so much for coming on and explaining it, David.
Well, my pleasure. Enjoyed it very much.
So we had a little technical problem. I originally recorded this segment on Friday, December 6th, which was the same day that I recorded the interview with David that you just heard. and I was talking about the murder of the United Healthcare CEO. Unfortunately, that recording has been lost in the internet. I have no idea what really happened there. But because of that, I can now record this on Wednesday, the 11th of December, when we actually know more about the topic that I was talking about. So the suspect has been caught and arrested and charged with a couple of different crimes. And so we can talk about this with a little bit more knowledge than we would have been able to if I had actually had the version we had on Friday. So first, let's talk about the reaction that we've seen. So this individual murdered the CEO of United Healthcare, which is one of the largest private insurance companies, the largest private insurance company in the United States. The CEO's name was Brian Thompson. He was 50 years old, murdered in New York City, in Midtown Manhattan, at about 7 a.m. by someone who had a silencer on a weapon, came up behind him, shot him in the back, was lying in wait for him, had clearly been scoping out the situation, and shot him several times until he was dead right there on the sidewalk. Escaped, got away, but has since been apprehended, was found in Pennsylvania several days later, was arrested, and is now in the process of being charged for this murder. The reaction that we've seen from a lot of different people, online especially, but also in media, responding to a lot of this online commentary, has been absolutely revolting. And it's something that we need to discuss, because the seeming undertone of a lot of this is that there's this seething body of resentment against American healthcare. And this was just a manifestation of that. And you've seen a lot of statements to the effect of, violence is wrong, but he kind of had a point. Or violence is wrong, but actually the CEO is a murderer because private health insurance companies kill people. And, first we should stipulate there are lots of problems with the United States healthcare system. I did an episode of this podcast with Theo Merkel from Paragon Health Institute where we talked about some of those problems. These are well-known issues that we have, again, like I said, we've talked about in the past year. The murder of someone is really not a great time to make an issue of those. That's not really what we should do, just out of respect and basic civilizational decency, I think. But we know that those problems exist, and we know that people suffer. They absolutely do. The problem with a lot of the response to this has been basically that the reason that these problems exist is solely because of private health insurance companies, and that actually Americans all hate this. And neither of these are correct. Every health insurance and health care system, and again, those are two different things. The health insurance companies are not the ones actually providing the care. They're helping to pay for it. Any health insurance and health care system has to make choices about how to allocate scarce resources. Scarcity is a word that people commonly use to refer to situations that are extremely pressing, right? So we say there's a scarcity of water in a desert, right? But in economics, when we talk about scarcity, we just mean the simple fact that people have unlimited wants and the resources to fulfill them are limited. And I want to say that again because it's really important. People have unlimited wants, but the resources to fulfill them are limited. And so because of that, we have to make choices about how those resources get used. Now, there are lots of different ways to make those choices. In the healthcare context, A lot of people want the government to be the one to make those choices. They want to say healthcare is a human right. Give the government power to run it and to finance it. And then, boom, you've solved this problem. Now it's universal. Now everybody has it. And that's not how it would work. Governments in countries with government-run healthcare have to make choices about how resources get used. And guess what? Lots of people get denied coverage and they get denied care. They might not get denied coverage on paper, but if your coverage isn't actually useful for getting what you want, then you're in effect being denied that as well. An example of this is colonoscopies. So in the United States, it's relatively common for people over the age of 50 to get colonoscopies. And the reason that people do that is we know that it's a form of cancer that primarily affects older people. And we know that it's a form of cancer that if we catch it early, it can be cured. And so a lot of people do this in the United States, and a lot of times insurance covers it because people think it's worthwhile to them to have the peace of mind to know that they don't have colon cancer, because it's very difficult to detect without doing a colonoscopy. If you look at a system like England, where you have government-run healthcare, they have far fewer colonoscopies. And that also makes sense. From a government's perspective, if you have limited resources, which every system does, if you're the government and you're looking at colonoscopies as a procedure, you say, okay, this is a relatively time-consuming procedure, takes up space in medical facilities that could be used for people who are actually sick with something, right? Most people who get colonoscopies don't have colon cancer. So you're not actually making anybody better by doing a colonoscopy a lot of the time. So from a government planner's point of view, that's all just waste. We should cut back on that. We should prioritize actually curing people of stuff rather than doing preventive care like colonoscopies. And so in the UK, it's just much less common for people to have this done. And even so, in the United States, people still die from colon cancer, even though we do more colonoscopies. So from the government's point of view, the bang for the buck there just isn't that good. But from the patient's point of view, that's an option that they would like to have. In the United States, they have it. And the reason for that is that in the United States, we just spend way more money on health insurance or on health care than people do in other countries. And people will put that number out there and say, look, this is ridiculous. But it's also true that Americans get a lot more health care than people in other countries do. It's not like all that money just gets wasted. Now, of course, there is plenty of waste, administrative costs, things like that. Those are problems. But it's nonetheless true that Americans get a lot more health care because they pay for a lot more health care. And a lot of that payment comes through the private health insurance system. Big chunk of it comes from the government health insurance system too, by the way. Medicare, Medicaid. So it's not like we have this like crazy free market paradise either. But a lot of times, the reason that we're paying more is that we're actually getting more. Now, we can also say, okay, we're getting more healthcare, but are we getting better results on healthcare? And you can look at some measures in which we are and some measures in which we aren't. And that's a topic for another podcast. The point I want to make here is just that the major criticism of the United States healthcare system is not that it doesn't get enough care. It's, if anything, we do too much. We waste money on care that we actually don't need. And so when you have people right now talking about how the brutal American health insurance system is denying people care, again, does that happen from time to time? Yes, it happens in every system from time to time. The larger systemic problem that we have in the United States, though, is actually way too much care on various different issues. And the part of our healthcare system that is trying to tamp down on that is the private insurance companies. If you're a doctor or a hospital system. And you get to just decide how much you get to charge. You're going to charge a lot of money. Why wouldn't you? What we have is an adversarial process where the health insurance company then comes in and says, you know what, no, that's not the right price. That shouldn't be that high. We think it should be this price. And through that process, you narrow in on some kind of an equilibrium. Is this a market equilibrium price? No, it's not. It's subject to lots and lots of different regulations. It's in many cases just the two sides negotiating. There's not a lot of competition between them. But it is a process where the insurance company is the one that's actually trying to bring the price down. And the providers are the ones who are trying to push the price up. And we saw this recently with anesthesiology. In the commotion around this murder, the American Anesthesiologists Association was able to get a win for its members, who are anesthesiologists. That was praised by a lot of people who claim to believe that this is a problem. What there was a government rule about payments for anesthesiology, and it said, look, we're going to cap these at certain amounts of time. The payment we're going to cap at an amount of time because you bill anesthesiology by time. And they say, we're going to cap the amount of time for certain surgeries based on what we think it should take so that anesthesiologists don't have an incentive to go slower and take longer to get more money because you get to charge for more anesthesiology. And the Anesthesiologists Association said, no, we should be able to charge however much we want, essentially. And this was framed by a lot of these same critics of American healthcare as being some terrible rule that the insurance companies were coming up with. And that if your surgery took longer, you just wouldn't get anesthesiology and you'd just be in pain. And that was never what this was about. It was about, how do you bill this? Do you just get unlimited power to name your price, or are we going to cap it at a certain level? And these insurance companies, they got rid of this rule. Now, they'd probably say that it wasn't in response to the social media commentary about this murder, but it looked like it was, even if it wasn't actually. And a lot of the people on social media understood it to be. So they think it worked. So they're going to try to do it again. We should not be allowing decisions like this to be made by crazy people on the internet who are praising a murderer. That's a really bad way to make decisions. Remember I said at the beginning, there are lots of different ways to make decisions about how to allocate resources. Listening to crazy people on the internet is probably the worst way to do it. So this leads me to the connection between socialism and violence, which I mentioned in the start. And I think this is a really important, larger point than just this specific instance. But this instance does give a good illustration of it. You know, Ludwig von Mises has his book called Human Action, where he talks about how the fundamental thing about economics is that people do stuff. And when they do stuff and interact with each other, we get markets. And that this is a very natural and normal thing. When people want to suspend markets, they can pass laws with the government and say, we don't think that this market result was right. We're going to mandate a different one. And, you know, a fair number of people are going to just follow the rules because they're good citizens and that's what they want to do. But you're going to have some people who don't. And so maybe you make some kind of penalty for it. You do something more. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if you disobey long enough a socialist rule, and by socialist, I mean replacing the market system with a government-planned alternative. If you disobey that long enough, the result is going to be violence. You have to be coerced to act against your self-interest and to act against what the natural market result would be. Does it usually get to that point? No. But the logic of it says that it ultimately
will if the resistance is strong enough. And when you see, so when you see an economic supply-demand graph with that equilibrium point in the middle, just keep in mind, if you want to get away from that point, you have to coerce people to do something that they wouldn't otherwise want to do. And that's ultimately what socialism requires. And here I'm talking about like any kind of rule that would do that. So again, in a developed country like the United States, a lot of times you don't actually have to do that. People just follow the rules because that's what they're used to doing. But in the online reaction from a lot of socialist people, quite frankly, to this murder of Brian Thompson, you see this bloodlust, this belief that actually violence is justified to get the socialist result that we want. And it's important to understand that they are being consistent with their beliefs, whether they actually understand that or not. They're being consistent. Socialism requires coercion, and that means sometimes violence. And we should be very, very clear about that. Marxism tries to turn this around on capitalists and says, oh, actually capitalism is violence. And really the answer is that, yeah, people are violent. People do violent things. And that happens in any system, no matter what. But the logic of the market system is one of voluntary exchange, not coerced, and one where both sides walk away happier. The logic of socialism is coercion, not voluntary, and zero sum, where one side is better and the other side is worse off. And that we need that coercion to take from the bad guys and give to the good guys. So ask yourself, which of those systems is more likely to generate violence? Which one sounds more violent to you? The market or socialism? It's going to be socialism, just because of what it's trying to do. Now, this supposedly brutal, awful American healthcare system, what do people actually think about it? Well, Kaiser Family Foundation, which does top quality research on healthcare issues, they did a big survey about this last year, in 2023. It's very thorough, very good sample, everything you could want. And they asked people, what do you think about your health insurance? 81% of Americans, 81% said that their health insurance was either excellent or good. Only 3% said it was poor. That includes all health insurance customers in the United States. Whether they have Medicare, Medicaid, private insurance, employer insurance, individual insurance, doesn't matter, all of it. All of it across the board. Only 3% of people said they have poor health insurance. And by the way, the plans that rated the lowest were still 73% of people said that they were good or excellent. So lowest is a relative here. But the lowest rated were Obamacare marketplace plans, which was supposed to be the solution to American healthcare back when it was passed in 2010. So we should be very skeptical of these people who are claiming that they have the solution for American healthcare this time, especially because they're cheering for a murderer. And that leads to another very odd thing about how socialism usually works. This is true of basically every country that's gone socialist. It's not actually the workers who get mad. Socialist theory is that, the proletariat rises up and because they become conscious of their victimization in the capitalist system, and then they overthrow the elites. But what happens every time is it's actually the elites who are overthrowing the workers, and intellectuals specifically. This guy who killed Brian Thompson was Ivy League educated. He came from a very, very wealthy family. He went to a very expensive private high school. He had lots of money. He was living in Hawaii. Brian Thompson, the guy who got killed, the CEO, was born in a small farming town in Iowa. His father didn't work in healthcare. His father worked at a grain elevator. He went to public school. He was a valedictorian. But he was valedictorian in a small Iowa high school of about 300 people. He worked his way up. He became an accountant. That's how he started at United Healthcare as an accountant. He was not on some track to the C-suite from birth. He worked his way up. He was very well liked by all of his coworkers, seen as a very smart guy, but also as a very helpful team player. And he had worked his way all the way up to be CEO of United Healthcare in 2021. As usual, this is as usual. The people who claim to be speaking up for the workers, the people who claim to be speaking up for the downtrodden, are themselves not downtrodden at all. And the people who are actually doing the work aren't making any of these grand claims because they actually know something about the value of hard work, the value of developing yourself and developing your skills and working your way up through the business world. Nobody handed Brian Thompson anything. I'm sure he got some good breaks along the way. This is a guy who worked his way up in a way that's extremely admirable, in a way that we should want other people to do. The United States of America is still a country where the son of a grain elevator operator in Iowa can go to public school, go to a public university, become an accountant, and work his way up and become the CEO of one of the most valuable companies in the world. That happens in the United States. That doesn't happen in most other places, folks. That's the promise of this country, and we cannot let people who are praising violence try to take it away. Now it's time for the paper of the episode. But before that, if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us to know that you enjoy the show, and it makes the show more visible for others to start listening as well. I let David pick the paper of the episode. It's from the Competitive Enterprise Institute in May 2024, edited by Ryan Young. It's called Adam Smith's Guide to Life, Loveliness, and the Modern Economy. Here's David to tell you about it.
I came across a paper by accident at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which is a bit ironic because I had spent a lot of time in 2023 focused on the anniversary of Adam Smith, as did National Review and so forth. And yet I did not see until more recently a paper that the CEI put out just a number of months ago, filled with a handful of different essays and whatnot, that they titled Adam Smith's Guide to Life, Loveliness, and the Modern Economy. And just putting together a handful of contributions from different friends and thought leaders at CEI. Some of these very short contributions, I mean, all in the whole piece is about 80 pages, but each of the papers along the way are only 2 to 3. And some of them were really outstanding at summarizing something that I think has become increasingly important in the cause du jour. We do not need to defend Adam Smith and his record merely to correct a historical record, although that's quite important, but it's really being used as a propagandist battle in the current fight over a market economy and over the coexistence of liberty and virtue. And this was just a really well done piece by Competitive Enterprise Institute. Again, the title being Adam Smith's Guide to Life, Loveliness, and the Modern Economy.
Adam Smith's Guide to Life, Loveliness, and the Modern Economy from CEI. Read it. That's all for today. Remember, the economy is complicated and nobody has all the answers, but markets work.